Obviously, we're not going to spend the press conference rehearsing everything that's been said this morning and everything that's in our documents. There are two major documents. One are the summary of findings of the final session, which is a larger document. I'm not sure whether you've had that or whether you've seen it or certainly had time to read it. But that's the one I referred to in my session, which spells out really a summary of the legal findings of the 4 sessions and a little more, much more on prisoners than we'd done before. Secondly, there's a shorter document which Angela's been using and referring to, and I was just going to use that as a springboard for any questions that you may have, because the real question is obviously where do we go from here? That's probably one of your questions. So as long as everybody's either had access to, I think they're on the table at the back, these two documents that I've mentioned. May I also say, and make clear that all the papers that have been presented in relation to Barcelona, London, New York, and so forth, all of them, all the individual papers, and Cape Town, there are not only the reports themselves emanating from each one, but also the papers that were presented today, including one I'd written on achievements. They're all going to be online. You can look them all up, and if it's necessary to get them printed off, I'm sure that can be. So that's the general picture. Now, so far as the short document, future actions and ways forward, can I just pick out a few paragraphs which we think matter a great deal, but obviously it all matters, but it's got to prioritize. Paragraph number, if you've got it in front of you, it's paragraph number 2, and that is to ensure that the spirit of Stefan Hessel is maintained. In particular, the ambition and objective he had to ensure that, so far as is possible, the wordings is all political actors and civil society bring pressure to bear on Israel to halt its violation of international law. There's much more to it than that. So it's the spirit of Stefan is extremely important. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is actually paragraphs 3 and 4. You've heard a lot about the ICC, but we set a lot of store by the fact that there is a way forward there that is achievable provided there's a political will, both within the international community and obviously going right back to Palestine. So that's about acceding to the Rome Statute and investigating crimes that have been committed. That's so far as the ICC is concerned. And then there are specific actions that we require from the UN, and one of them is in paragraph 6, mentioned by Angela, and that's the reconstitution of the UN Special Committee Against Apartheid. Again, I don't go any further than that for the moment. Paragraphs 9 and 10 deal with the European Union, very important, we think, because this, in fact, is where we kicked off in Barcelona, that EU bodies implement the European Parliament's resolution calling for its suspension of EU-Israel Association Agreement, thereby putting an end to the context of irresponsibility that Israel continues to enjoy. And number 10, the EU is called upon to ban the importation of all settlement products. Then there's some paragraphs about universal jurisdiction. I'm not dealing with those. And then paragraph 13, action needed by all states to implement the recommendations of, effectively, the Goldstone Report in paragraph 1975A. So again, don't read it out, but that's another prime factor. I'm over the page. Paragraph 14, we require the United States, a lot's been said about the United States, to cease its unequivocal economic, military, and diplomatic support for Israel, without which we have made it clear Israel would have difficulty sustaining its position. Corporations, multinationals, paragraph 17, we essentially join with the BDS movement in the way in which boycotts, and obviously, in fact, there are other things besides boycotts, but targeting companies that are complicit in the illegalities being committed. That is continued in the paragraph 18, it's the same sort of point. I don't read it out because you've had it recently. And then I really go towards the end, paragraphs 24, 25, and 26, which 24 addresses the question of Palestinian prisoners, which I say straight away, I don't think we'd really addressed it specifically in other hearings in other places until we got here, and now it is, and you've heard for the demands that have already been made, so I don't reread it. And then the work towards peace, it's extremely important, paragraph 23, for everyone to recognize that, and it's been said many times, we do not finish our work here. It is a continuing commitment that we're making towards the peace and justice in Palestine, which is how it's spelt out. Each individual juror reaffirms their commitment to continue working in this direction and commits to take it upon themselves to ensure the continual dissemination of the work of the tribunal in their respective constituencies, societies, and networks. I think the idea is, in fact, that not that we just take it back to where we come from, but that actually we also agree to take it to places we don't come from, other places, other organizations. So I think the most important thing that I've been trying to say to people, because they say, what's the most important thing? I think the most important thing is that the Palestinian people and those who are locked up do not feel isolated. In other words, it's solidarity. And then 26 are the future, if you like, projects that we intend to carry out. And again, I'd be insulting your intelligence to read them all out, but they're there. So hopefully, I've gone rather rapidly because I know a lot of this has been traversed in the hearings upstairs. So just giving you a taste, giving you time to think of any questions you might want to ask. Could you please identify yourself when you ask the question and any media organization you represent, and then could you address it either to the whole jury or to particular jurors? There's a gentleman there and a gentleman with scarf. So I'll take you, sir, first, and then, yeah.
I apologize, me. I shall put the question in French, if you don't mind. Et j'aimerais poser la question peut-être plus particulièrement à Pierre Galland. À Pierre Galland, j'ai deux... Ah, pardon, excusez-moi, Luc Beyer de Ric. J'ai présenté 18 ans le journal télévisé belge et j'étais parlementaire pendant 2 mandats. Et je dirais la première question, je la poserai comme journaliste et la deuxième, comme journaliste bien sûr, puisque seuls les journalistes sont admis ici, mais en me référant à ma qualité de parlementaire. Alors la première question, Pierre a évoqué tout à l'heure le problème extrêmement difficile, extrêmement douloureux de Caterpillar. Et je l'interroge, et je vous interroge aussi, sur la manière très difficile, je dirais, de concilier les exigences morales, c'est-à-dire la solidarité au peuple palestinien, et nous sommes tous liés ici par ce principe de solidarité au peuple palestinien, et les impératifs économiques. La Belgique a perdu, je crois, en 3 semaines de temps, 16 000 emplois. 16 000 emplois. C'est une véritable hémorragie sociale. Et dans cette hémorragie sociale, il y a 1400 places à Caterpillar qui ont été rayées d'un trait de plume. Alors j'ai appris avec bonheur que les ouvriers de Caterpillar...
Excusez-moi, la question, s'il vous plaît.
Eh bien, comment concilier cette exigence morale et l'impératif économique? Caterpillar a travaillé, comme d'autres sociétés que vous avez dénoncées légitimement, illégitimement pour la Palestine, pour Israël. Comment concilier?
Oui.
La deuxième chose, c'est le mythe de Sisyphe.
Okay.
Le mythe de Sisyphe, et comme parlementaire, moi j'ai perdu mon siège. J'ai perdu mon siège comme parlementaire européen, j'ai perdu mon siège parce que je me suis élevé en faveur justement de la suspension des protocoles commerciaux avec Israël. Ça remonte à 1989 et je vois que la même question est aujourd'hui posée et que c'est véritablement le mythe de Sisyphe. Comment faire en sorte que ça cesse d'être le mythe de Sisyphe? Je vous remercie.
Mais je vais rapidement répondre. À la première question, ce n'est pas difficile. Toute la session de Londres a répondu. Il suffit d'aller voir les textes. Il n'y a pas une question d'abord de morale, il y a une question de droit. Le droit international s'applique aux entreprises. Une entreprise qui participe de manière illégale à l'occupation d'un autre État, d'un pays ou d'un espace non encore identifié comme État à l'époque, eh bien, elle se met en contravention avec les normes du droit international. C'est normatif aussi. Et donc, je ne pense pas qu'on puisse opposer, disons, la valeur morale à ce qu'est la Convention et le droit international tel qu'il existe aujourd'hui. Et ça a été clarifié pendant toute la session de Londres. Et à ce sujet-là, je dirais aussi, on peut poser la question exactement en sens inverse. Pendant la lutte contre l'apartheid, ce sont les travailleurs de la COSATU eux-mêmes qui ont fait l'appel à lancer le boycott. Et alors que ces gens-là se trouvaient dans des conditions de travail qui étaient des conditions de travail vraiment fragiles, élémentaires et souvent sous-payées, ces gens-là nous ont clairement, ils ont envoyé des missions à travers toute l'Europe pour appeler au boycott des produits d'Afrique du Sud, pour appeler notamment au boycott des produits de United Fruit, des produits qui étaient ceux des oranges qui étaient sur nos marchés et qui venaient de l'Afrique du Sud. C'est eux qui l'ont fait. Ils savaient très bien que pendant ce temps-là, ils allaient perdre en termes d'emploi et qu'ils allaient gagner en termes de dignité et en termes de lutte politique. Et donc je pense qu'il ne faut pas se tromper dans ce domaine-là. On peut sinon toujours dire nous allons produire des armes, si nous ne les vendons pas, c'est les autres qui les vendent. Non, dès qu'on sait à quoi elles servent, et si elles servent pour des causes qui ne sont pas en conformité avec le droit international, il n'y a pas lieu de soutenir une hypothèse de perte d'emploi ou de valeur morale que ça pourrait représenter. Et pour la question des parlementaires, les questions des parlementaires, il y a plusieurs personnes ici à cette table, notamment Cynthia McKinney, qui pourrait répondre. Elle aussi, elle a perdu son poste de membre du Congrès pour avoir pris position clairement sur des valeurs éthiques et des valeurs de combat en faveur du droit d'autres peuples et notamment du peuple palestinien. Donc ça, c'est évidemment le prix qu'on paye lorsqu'on veut être cohérent avec soi-même.
La question n'était pas ça, c'est comment...
Mais, wait, pardon.
Désolé, on va passer à une autre question.
Okay. Pierre, for those who don't speak French, could you do a one-paragraph summary?
One paragraph summary to say that that during the London session, we have worked on all the question of the compatibility between economic activity and activity serving Israel to occupy Palestine, and that you cannot oppose the contradiction that, well, it's clear that if some activity, economical activity, is to support Israel in the occupation, there is no other moral value to say, well, but it gives work to some of our workers in our country. It's not a contradiction. The rule is there. And secondly, for the question of that people like Cynthia or like Luc having take clear position in their political life, and after that they are excluded from the parliament for this reason, well, it's a question of coherence and how to avoid that. I believe to avoid it is to continue the work to build a clear and fair democracy.
I think Cynthia wants to say something about this.
Yes, I didn't know if I understood the gentleman's remarks, but I think I did get it based on the translation. And so what I would say is that maybe we didn't consider fully the role of the Israeli lobby in our deliberations. And so on the one hand, we can say that the United States must do this, or the United Kingdom must do this, but it falls quite short of the reality, of the political reality that people who are elected to office have to deal with. And that is that many of our elected representatives are there in those positions for misleadership based on the support that they're given by the Israeli lobby. And I don't think that the Israeli lobby as an entity appears not one time in any of our reports, and I think that is probably an omission that should be corrected.
Any other question?
Unless it's all right. Gentleman with a scarf there.
We have very limited time, so
Just 30 seconds. I would like to ask a question to Mrs. Corrigan-Maguire and Waters, if it's not a problem. Yes, I'm Stelios Fotinopoulos from the Greek newspaper Avgi. I would like to ask, do you believe that the spring of the social movements in the Mediterranean area, and especially in Greece, when there is a chance next period to have a change of power and have a left government in power, do you believe that this can be the first step of a stronger collaboration and alliance between the social movements and the liberation movement in Palestine and governments that have left parties in power? Thank you.
I think we are at a very important point in our history where people around the world are rising to call for their basic civil rights, their human rights, their economic rights, to call for freedom, to shove off dictatorships and tyrannies and unjust systems. And they are supporting really what a movement many years ago started with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where every right, every life is important, and not only for ourselves, but for each other. And we see under attack by governments our basic human rights, basic civil liberties, in the lie that it is a war against terrorism. It is a war against many ordinary people standing for their rights. So we need to, and we are, it's connecting right around the world the different movements who's just simply saying everybody's life's important. Everybody has a right to bread and education and freedom of speech. And we are the human family. And we do stand up for each other. And that is a fantastic movement. It's growing, it's spreading, it will not be stopped. It is the people movement. So when we support our Palestinian prisoners, we are also supporting right around the world all those movements who are demanding that our international law, our human rights, our rights, and that is fantastic. So what we've spelt out here, everybody knows, but what we have spelt out here is everyone's responsibility to work for human rights for everyone.
any other question?
Yeah, Ronnie. Yeah.
I want to address the last part of the question, which, as I understood it, was where left-wing governments come into power. Does this mean that we can expect a greater degree of pressure against Israel, greater stand against Israel? Well, one would hope and expect so, but civil society must be very mobilized and ensure that they continue to bring pressure on such governments. Because, for instance, I come from South Africa, where we have what you would call progressive, left-orientated government that came to power. But we must understand what happens in terms of the global economy and the general situation that Michael Mansfield was talking about. There is an extraordinary pressure that's brought to bear on governments, and they would tend, even left-wing, to stand back and not take up the issue as strongly as we would want them to. So it's incumbent on civil society, the NGOs, etc., to continue the campaign and to exert that pressure on all forms of government. It was your question. It's very, very important, that aspect. Thank you.
Any other question?
Okay, I'm taking the next question. Gentleman over there.
Michael, but let us be very concrete. You know that next, this month, in 10 days, there would be the World Social Forum in Tunisia. And the Russell Tribunal will send a delegation to the World Social Forum. And you know that during this World Social Forum, the last 2 days would be especially for Palestine. Work together around Mediterranean for Palestine. So it's the answer to your question.
Yeah, but I just want to be concrete on that. I was recently in Brazil at Porto Alegre, and I raised the question there. This Brazilian government is supposed to be progressive and left-wing. It continues to trade strongly on the arms issue with Israel. At Porto Alegre is the center of this trade. And I challenged the trade union movement, who initially said, our workers will lose their jobs. And I said, well, take this up with that in mind. You might be a pacifist, you might not like arms trade. I said, instead of trading with Israel, trade with South Africa, for instance.
Yeah, there's a
We have-
gentleman here who's been waiting, and then I'll come to another one over there. Sorry, just here on the left.
My name is Tu Magnussen, and I'm a freelance journalist from Denmark, also working for the Anti-Torture Support Foundation. I think we are many who have been very impressed by not only this session, but also the previous sessions of the Russell Tribunal. And I think what is very essential is now the call that you make for the UN. But I wondered a little bit when I looked the statement through that you haven't included the rejection of Israel in what you could call their participation in an examination in human rights. What I'm referring to is this universal periodical review where Israel recently, as the first country on the world besides Haiti after the earthquake, rejected to go on an evaluation or examination on how they fulfill international conventions. And I think this is a sign of the lack of willingness of Israel, which should be also put focus on in the further work of the Russell Tribunal on Palestine.
Yeah, I can answer that fairly quickly. It's a good point. We have put it in, we are aware of it, we have mentioned it in the full report. I'm just quickly trying to find the passage, but I've got to page 11. So we were aware, we do address it, and I'm particularly conscious because I was the one who went to Geneva, and I think that's where the ball started rolling. So and Israel did turn up on that occasion, but I know they've rejected it since. And personally, I think that is a real sign of movement yet again, that they're actually going to reject a very body to which, in a sense, they were signed up. And the world will see eventually. It takes time, but I think it's the building of a movement in which it is seen that Israel, well, I'm going to be quite straightforward, it's a pariah state. It's no longer a member of the world community. It does not respect the rule of law. It does not respect the Human Rights Council, which is pretty fundamental. So I think, we're aware. There's a gentleman...
There is a question here.
Oh, sorry. Well, there was somebody here. I have got my eye out. There was.
Yes, he.
All right, okay.
Thank you. Baudouin from newspaper Le Soir, Brussels. Did you ever, in your 3 years of work sessions, did you ever get any kind of reaction from Israel, whether from the official side or press coverage? This is the first question. And second one is about what one can imagine Israel would reply to your work is that you are not balanced because you don't raise the problem of terror, as they used to say. Thank you.
Well, I can deal with it fairly quickly. I mean, Israel has been invited, I think Angela mentioned it. Israel's been invited, or representatives from Israel have been invited or involved in I think all four. They knew we were happening. They knew anyway. So they were invited to make representations. And, of course, they chose not to because they want to, if they can, but increasingly they can't, ignore us. Now, so far as the criticism which we've had levelled at us many, many times is that we're biased and so forth. Well, I think it was Russell who said originally, an open mind isn't an empty one and shouldn't be. You can't confuse the two. The fact that we have strong views about the nature of human rights and the implementation of human rights, if that is a bias, we're proud to proclaim it. And that's all we've been trying to do, is implement material. That's why I think the World Court judgment, if they come along and accuse me of bias, I say, well, and of course they say the same about the World Court. In fact, if you disagree, you are biased. So there's no answer to that argument because they always construct, it's a self-answering question as far as they're concerned, and I don't think it has any logic to it whatsoever, and I don't think anybody who's got a head screwed on would take real notice of that criticism. And the increasingly sort of shrill cries from Israel place them in a remote place, I personally. So I don't think, we don't have difficulty with that.
Can
So,
I say something?
yeah, Roger wants to say something. And
All I'd like to say is this. I would challenge anybody from the current government of Israel to come and sit opposite Mike Mansfield in the other chair and challenge the findings of this tribunal and challenge his logic and challenge his knowledge of international law and challenge his devotion to human rights and challenge everything that he stands for. And I think it would be an extraordinarily unequal battle. So the shrill bantering from the other side of thick walls is entirely irrelevant to these proceedings, because these proceedings are based upon fact, testimony, and men of goodwill. So, frankly, that question is sort of irrelevant to what's been going on here over the last week and what's been going on over the last 5 sessions of the Russell Tribunal. And I do want to see that confrontation.
all I can
We
say is
have
bring
another
it on. Right, John.
I think the questioner raises a very important point, and that is the defense that Israel raises to virtually every criticism, namely that you don't understand because we are subject to terrorists and to terroristic behavior. I just want to say, first of all, that Israel is not unique. In any society in which you have a subjugated community, a subjugated society, you're going to find resistance, as you found during the Second World War. The occupied territories resisted Nazi occupation, and inevitably in such a situation, acts of resistance will be portrayed as acts of terror. And I'd just like to remind you that Nelson Mandela was portrayed as a terrorist. Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher described him until fairly recent times as a terrorist, and he was on the list of terrorists in the United States until fairly recently. So I really do think that we have to avoid this attempt on the part of Israel to justify every action on its part as a defense against terrorism. Thank you.
There's someone just there. I can't see the person. There we are.
Ronnie Barkan of Boycott from Within, living under Israeli apartheid. Since we're convened in Brussels, I would like to ask about the complicity of every member state of the EU, basically. You mentioned here that they work against the association agreement, specifically Article 2. What does that mean? I mean, other than protecting Israeli violations of international law, they work against their own laws, and there were just 23 members of the European Parliament who actually issued a call to Catherine Ashton asking to suspend the agreement. So if you could elaborate on that, please.
John, do you want to do it? Well, I think it's is it that you don't understand what it's saying in here? I'm not quite clear what your question is. That's why there's... Which European court are you talking about? Because there are several. Yeah. Well, it's quite. There are interesting possibilities in the European Court of Justice, obviously itself, which is in a different place. And I think that the question is the threshold of liability and establishing that. And we recognize, I think, very clearly that, it's getting political will to take action. I mean, you can ask people to put pressure on, but unless... Europe has played a very double game all the way through. Basically, they say one thing and then the individual states do another and they continue trading. So it's building, I think, a movement in which it's understood, and the states, the European states particularly, understand that they're sitting on a constituency that will not tolerate this, and that there is the possibility that it could end up in one of the European courts. The European court is, in fact, the most obvious one. So, I mean, I can't take it beyond that, because it's a political gesture to begin with, but using legal means. That's where it's going. And I mean, most members, at least I can only speak for the United Kingdom, but most people are quite unaware of what these agreements are, which has been part of our function, is to say, well, did you know there was this agreement? Or Israel gets preferential treatment in Europe. And they go, oh, do they? For what? And then they don't know. And no one blames them, because the media are not that interested, and I don't mean you media here, but the media generally aren't interested in raising these topics because there's too many vested interests. I don't know whether anybody wants to add anything. No? Okay. Gentleman, sorry, have I missed someone at the back? I can't see everybody, but there's a gentleman in the front row.
Christophe Calwaert from the Belgian news site De Wereld Morgen. You seem to expect a lot from the BDS campaign. How strong is this campaign for the moment? Will it ever be the same? Will it have the same as the campaign against South Africa? And how are you going to promote it? I've seen that Roger Waters has written an open letter. Were there already any answers from other pop stars on it? Yeah.
Unless they're only in this room, none of them have seen it, because the first draft of it I presented to the jury today for comments or whatever, so it hasn't actually been published anywhere yet. But, you know, funnily enough, I was sitting here a few minutes ago remembering little Stephen and Bruce and whoever else wandering down the street saying, no, 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 we ain't going to sing in Sun City. You remember that song? And it had a great kind of rhythmic beat behind it. And there is no question but that I will be approaching little Stephen and saying, hey, come on, man, why don't we at least redo that song? Because we're looking at exactly the same situation now that we were then. And in fact, the movement that spread from music to sport and eventually to political will back in the days of apartheid South Africa was extremely effective. And the possibility exists, if we can get past the fear of the Jewish lobby in the United States of America, that a similar movement could have a similar effect. The reason that I've held off until now from writing this open letter to everybody, you know, there are a number of people, I have to say, on board already, is because, you know, these things are always a bit delicate. I think we're at a tipping point. I think that the work that these people have done, and they did most of it before I came on board, is having a real genuine effect, and that slowly but surely the moral high ground that Mike was talking about in his speech earlier is being accepted, that it resides on this side of this table, and that the Israeli government has no answers for any of the questions that we're posing for them. And in fact, interestingly enough, I don't know if any of you have seen it, but there's a very interesting new documentary out called The Gatekeepers, which uses interviews with the last 6 heads of Shin Bet, and to a man, they accept that they tactically have got everything completely wrong since 1947. And that though they may have won the odd battle because their firepower is greater, they have lost the war, and they're really worried about what they're going to do about it, because they don't see much future for Israel unless they entirely change their tactics. So I would advise everybody who hasn't seen this movie, make sure you go and check it out, because it's a fascinating piece.
We've got just technical. We've got 10 minutes, so please, short questions, to the point. Thank you.
Well, sorry, Tony wants to.
It's not for the tribunal to organize a boycott. It's for your listeners, your readers, your viewers to organize the boycott. The anti-apartheid boycott started small. It became vast. It can be done. We will do it. You will do it.
Angela?
Yes, I also wanted to point out that oftentimes when we think of the boycott associated with the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, we focus on its full-blown expression. We don't think about the enormous work that was required over many, many years to create this boycott. I can remember when the first college in the U.S. divested, and people said, well, they're just a small progressive college. Nobody else is going to do that. And of course, eventually, vast numbers of universities divested. The boycott in the U.S. became one of the primary expressions of the movement against apartheid. And just as it was pointed out by John Dugard a little while ago, there was a time when Nelson Mandela was represented as a terrorist. And so let us accept this challenge and do the work that is required to, further expand the movement to boycott, divest, and exercise and confer sanctions. Over the last several years, we've seen it grow in significance, and it is only possible now for it to get larger and more powerful. So yes, let's think of it as a challenge, not as a fait accompli.
Further to that point, it would have been entirely unthinkable 10 years ago that a number of things that have happened in the last 6 months, the student body in the University of Pennsylvania divested, the University of California at Irving divested. There was a big debate about divestment in the University of California, Stanford last week, and in Brooklyn College just 3 weeks ago, they actually had a debate where Omar Bagoti, who's one of the leading lights of the BDS movement, actually spoke at the college, and although there was a big furore of people saying, oh, blah, 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 it happened, and this would have been unthinkable a number of years ago. And this is the thin end of a very thick wedge, and I think the thick end of that wedge is going to bloom and burgeon and bear fruit. And I have every hope that a big boycott movement will develop over the next 6 months or year. So we're supremely confident.
I think on the BDS, if we can connect the dots to all the movements throughout the world so that we all see that what's happening in Palestine really affects us as well. And Europe is becoming more and more militarized through NATO. While you are asked to tighten your belts for austerity cuts, more money is being poured into the military, corporate, industrial complex. Now, Europe gives more money to Israel in the line of funding, and military research gets enormous amounts of money. Israel spends a lot of that money on research and arms. Israel is now the 6th most armed nation in the world. It has its nuclear bombs, and it's building drones like everybody else is doing. Israel would love to be part of NATO, and then NATO, I've just returned from Afghanistan, where young men said to us how 2 of their little friends went out on the mountains to gather wood to burn a fire because they're hungry and dying of poverty. And these drones are built here in Europe and other countries and in places like Israel. We have to connect the dots. If we don't connect the dots, we're all digging our own little pitch, and we think our little pitch is important. But if we connect the dots to boycotting arms, Britain, after apartheid ended in South Africa, Tony Blair went to South Africa and told them how they needed arms, and South Africa spent a fortune on arms from Britain, while people in South Africa are still hungry. We have to connect the dots, and the movements have to cooperate in challenging and stopping this arms race, militarization of the world.
There's a question there, sorry.
Thank you very much. Dave Cronin is my name. I work for a website called The Electronic Intifada. I'd just like to ask if any of you on the panel have a response to the recent remarks made by the French President Francois Hollande when he was paying tribute to your friend Stéphane Hessel, and in particular the fact that Hollande chose to emphasize the fact that he disagreed with Hessel's work on Palestine. Do you think that Mr. Hollande and other European leaders are more interested in courting are remaining on the side with the Zionist lobby than in demanding justice for the Palestinian people? Thank you very much.
Well, I have a short, ready answer. I do think that I have this feeling about power corrupting, and people in power want to stay there, and they normally want to do everything possible to maintain that. And one of the ways they maintain it is by placating a powerful lobby within their country. And we're all, and I think Cynthia made the point a little bit earlier, or somebody did anyway, about the fact that we may have overlooked, as a specific topic, Cynthia did, specific topic, the Zionist lobby. And we have to be clear, we're not talking about a Jewish lobby, we're not talking about the Jewish people, we're talking about a Zionist lobby. It is a Zionist state, it was built in that way, and the lobby is extremely strong, both in the United States and in the United Kingdom and throughout Europe. And I have no doubt there's a lobby in France as well. My suspicion is that, and it's very rare, obviously, for somebody to be quite as obvious as that, that he should disagree. But then I have to confess I didn't see his precise remarks. But nevertheless, you know, I think we all feel that the Zionist lobby is lurking in the background of these major political decisions because of basically what Mairead just talked about. The arms trade is there between all of them. I'm getting told it's execution time.
Yeah, it's 2 more questions and that's it.
Okay. I can't see. Is there someone right at the back?
No, I think that's it.
That's it?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your attendance.
Thanks very much.